All right. Well, today we have a real treat. We have Dr. Christy Kane with us today, and she is a mental health counselor who practices in Utah. And she's a sought after speaker. She gives workshops, and her specialty is working with teenagers and adults, where she provides evidence based research on brain functioning and how electronics impact the neurotransmitters in the brain, and really how to mitigate, getting in an addiction, right, to electronics. So I'm really happy that she is willing to come on. Welcome, Dr. Kane. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, the last time we were together was at a United Nations conference there in Salt Lake.
Yes, that was kind of fun, wasn't it?
Yeah, where we presented on on a panel, and there was a lot of interest in that workshop, and I was grateful to see that. So, anyway, what I wanted to do is ask you first, how did you get into this? Like, what initiated your interest in how electronics impact the brain?
When I was working on my dissertation, we began to see the heightened increase of anxiety, depression, and teenage suicide ideation. And as scientists, anytime we see, substantial gains of negative markers in the mental health world, we begin to ask why. And based on research, one of the main impacting possibilities was the increased usage of cell phones. And so I started looking at all the research that had been done worldwide based on the amount of hours kids were in the electronic world, what were they using, video games, social media. At the same time, the comparison of that information to the rates of suicide, teenage depression, anxiety. And so that's how that kind of started for me, was why today is mental health such a crisis in the world?
Yeah, what's causing all this?
Yeah.
When we
What's
know
so
the
different?
iPhone came out in 2007 and the iPad in 2010, we've definitely seen dramatic changes since then. And with the iPhone, you got full on video streaming, high
So
definition. And
the other time in the history of our country when we kind of matched the similar anxiety and depression wage was the 1990s. That's when the internet came into being. And then you saw a lull, and then you saw the smartphones come back in place. And, now that we as humans carry around this small miniature computer, as you said, that becomes our window to the world, we no longer develop or engage our brain in the habits that we used to. Both for adults and children. So like when I lecture, one thing I show adults is how the electronics have impacted their life. Back in my great-grandmother's generation, you memorized addresses, you memorized phone numbers. If you wanted to go somewhere, you plotted it on a paper map, or you took out the world atlas, right? If you wanted to talk to friends, you walked across the street and knocked on their door, you did gardening. If you met a friend on the street, you didn't have all these bubbles of exclusion. You were very comfortable giving them a hug or shaking their hand. Now today, my coined phrase when I present is we become the most social, antisocial generation of all time.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
We're Facebooking, we're Pinteresting, we're Snapchatting, we're Instagramming, we're sending emojis, we're text messaging, all in the dopamine-driven electronic world. And I just saw fascinating research the other day that showed that when the brain is overstimulated, the part of the brain that would naturally produce sympathy and empathy shuts off. That you actually have to go into more of a quiet, meditative, non-stimulatory place of the brain, almost in a daydreaming sense, to engage again that process of empathy and sympathy. So if you look at the electronic world, you look at the statistics of bullying, you look at the statistics of exploitation. We have much more sexual aggressiveness in the electronic world because the brain is playing with dopamine and being altered versus the older generations who spent more time in maybe a less engaged downtime world,
Yeah.
but a better healthily engaged world for the brain.
Yeah. When I
You had
look
to
back
think.
at, yeah, when I look back at how I grew up
Mhm.
and then how my kids grew up and then how kids are growing up today, it's three completely different experiences.
Mhm.
Now, you mentioned dopamine. So when I was listening to you present in Salt Lake, I was fascinated with how you talked about the three dopamine, three neurotransmitters.
Mhm.
So serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine. And could you just
Right.
describe, in whatever order you want,
Mhm.
those three neurotransmitters and how they are impacted by using electronics and why we should care,
Okay.
what the effect is having on that. That's kind of a big question, but I know everything you're going to say is going to be so interesting, so can't wait to hear.
So dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin are all beneficial and natural neurotransmitters for the brain. The question is how we engage them, how often we use them, and the environment that we're using them in, right? So dopamine. Dopamine is what we call an anticipatory neurotransmitter. So for example, on a positive side, if your birthday is coming up and you know you're going to get a present and you want to be excited about that, the brain sends dopamine into the synapses with the anticipation of getting the birthday party, the birthday present, seeing your friends. It would be terrible if we anticipated that and flatlined and there was no excitement, right? So
Mm-hmm.
dopamine is designed to excite us. It is the neurotransmitter that whenever we anticipate something, the brain puts dopamine into the synapse if it's going to create that excitement. Okay. So in the electronic world, there's a reason that video games level up. There's a reason why Snapchat and Instagram have likes. There's a reason Facebook has ads, likes, and all those kind of things, because it's the knowledge base that we send dopamine into our synapse. We anticipate something. So these young people in this social video gaming world spend on average 6.5 hours a day in the dopamine environment because those electronics create anticipation. Now, can you imagine what happens when likes don't happen or when people aren't getting texts? You know, our kids use this term called FOMO, fear of missing out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, literally, they're spending all this time in this dopamine charged world, which has negative side effects as well because they're using it to higher levels than any generation ever has. And so, with the issues with dopamine, we see depression, we see anxiety. Dopamine drives bullying in the electronic world, where I talked about the empathy and sympathy is turned off. And so all of this anticipatory stuff, nobody's going to play a video game if you never leveled up. Nobody's going to send a picture if nobody likes it. Nobody's going to go onto Facebook to see, ooh, what somebody else is doing if it wasn't there. And what drives that is the neurotransmitter dopamine. It's an anticipatory transmitter that can be addiction forming. It's the same neurotransmitter that drugs play with. So when someone takes an opioid,
Yeah.
the brain then does something different with the dopamine. It either leaves the dopamine in the synapse longer or it puts too much dopamine in the synapse. And so electronics are playing with that same neurotransmitter, and that's why they can become addictive over time. You have countries now passing laws against social media. You have countries trying to recommend that kids spend less than 3 hours a day in the electronic world. You even have classrooms in some countries banning any type of personal electronic devices in school because of this unsettling process of too much dopamine in the brain. And it's all about anticipation. That's why parents can see how upset a child gets if they take the video game away. Like I've heard from a lot of parents who say, well, I just tell them they're going to lose their cell phone and then they go like crazy people. And I'm like, but that's because neurologically you've just taken away what has been stimulating their brain and is their social network. So don't just suddenly take a kid's cell phone away. I'm not anti-electronics. It's about balance. So that's what parents need to understand. Those electronics are designed to play with dopamine.
Yeah.
Okay.
So dopamine is big. And I've heard it also called the molecule of motivation.
Mhm.
I heard about an experiment that if you put a rat in a cage and you took away the rat's dopamine, you could put food on the other side of the cage and the rat would never get up and go get the food because it didn't have the dopamine to like push it, to
It's that.
anticipate, to be excited, to motivate it to go get the food. It would starve, even
Mhm.
though it's hungry. And so it's huge, and it's really important in our brains to have that, but definitely can become an addiction and be a problem. So what about serotonin and oxytocin as far as
So
electronic?
serotonin is the natural mood stabilizing neurotransmitter that our brain produces. It's actually supposed to regulate us between anxiety and depression, is what serotonin does. And it does that naturally. And serotonin is really based on types of healthy food that we eat so that the brain can produce serotonin and use serotonin. Now, lots of people know about serotonin and understand that we need to be eating foods high in serotonin every day because it's beneficial to help regulate our moods. The one thing a lot of people do not understand is that there's another hormone produced called cortisol.
Mhm.
Cortisol is produced when we are afraid, when we are stressed, like the fight and flight process of the brain produces cortisol to protect the synapses. Okay, it goes in
Right.
and coats the ends of the neurons in the synapse to protect the body during this heightened time of, fight and flight. So here's what happens. If we stay stressed for too long, the cortisol stays in that synapse area and prohibits the brain uptaking serotonin. So people need to understand that not only do they need to be eating foods high in serotonin, they also have to allow their brain to absorb serotonin by pulling out of stress. And the national average for us as citizens nowadays is about 4 to 5 hours a day in a stress level. So why do we see higher anxiety and maybe higher depression? Is
Mhm.
because although we're getting more health conscious, everybody's into green smoothies and all this stuff, we're not changing the stress component. So the brain is not getting to absorb the serotonin. One of the first things when I have clients come in who see me who are struggling with depression or anxiety, I ask, where are your serotonin levels? And then where's your stress factor that's preventing your body to naturally absorbing the serotonin that helps stabilize the brain and stabilize the mood? But the critical factor again is you can change your diet, but if you don't change the stress factor, it doesn't matter how
Lifestyle.
much serotonin.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So
And
both
we
diet and lifestyle.
Yep, and electronics create stress and overstimulate. You can see aggression increase in kids who are playing very violent video games. And so you can see that video games and social media, depending on what they're looking at, can move a kid into that fight and flight process of the brain as they're stressed and then they don't have the uptake of serotonin.
Yeah. I saw that in my own kids. I'd say, okay, it's time for dinner, time to go, time to stop playing the game, whatever. And there were a couple times when there was some definite explosive anger.
Yeah, there's
And
and
it's,
change in mood.
yeah, and it's not like they were bad kids. It was just, it's neurologically, you know,
Mhm.
that was, driving them to be very upset.
I
So,
think as we educate parents and as I think parents come to understand the brain process, like your example with your kids, it allows us to remove shame and think, oh, kids are bad, which they're not. It's understanding. The brain really does change. I mean, we can do brain scans now that show that positive thoughts actually improve the transmitter process in the brain in a positive way, and that negative thoughts actually affect it negatively. So, that old fashioned statement of positive thinking is beneficial. Well, now we can electronically prove that.
yeah.
Another study that was done at the University of Utah that was very fascinating is they showed individuals who had spiritual experiences, not religion, but spiritual experiences in the fMRI machine was very powerful and beneficial to the brain. We don't have a lot of those meditative spiritual experiences on social media and video games. We tend to have them more often in that meditative world or in that one-on-one face-to-face world of deep conversation.
Yeah.
So that's beneficial. Now you asked me about oxytocin. Oxytocin is the cuddle hormone neurotransmitter that's produced through human touch. So like when a mother's getting ready to give birth to her baby, the neurotransmitter hormone that's increased is oxytocin. It's the bonding chemical. And so when we set eye to eye, knee to knee, when we embrace each other, we're producing oxytocin. And oxytocin so foundationally stabilizes us humans. If you look at the research, communal communities that are much more involved in human connection, and they don't have like this big European bubble that a lot of us carry around, don't have the same levels of anxiety and depression because they're used to that human connection. And the bad thing is that in some of the areas where kids would be held, like in religious services or at school, get a hug from a teacher, that's no longer allowed. And they may not be getting that affection at home. And even like I lecture that people should get 8 hugs a day for 8 seconds. Now, is there a solid science behind that? Heck, it could be 10 hugs a day for 5 seconds. The point of the research that I did is that the increased levels of connection help to decrease the levels of anxiety and depression. So I ask individuals to make sure that they get 8 hugs a day for 8 seconds. And I've had so many people send me text messages, send me emails and say, you know what, Dr. Kane, the biggest thing that we took away from your lecture was the 8 hugs.
Yeah.
You know, I had a mom, it was a funny story. Her and her daughter had a disagreement one morning and they were pretty heated. And the daughter got to the door to walk out and said, well, at least give me my hug for 8 seconds. You know, and so you can tell that it's making an impact. I've had parents say that now when they come home, the little younger kids come up and count 10 or 8, 7, 6, you know.
Yeah.
And it's so simple, but it's funny when I recommend that. I'm amazed at how many people say, do you know how long 8 seconds is? Have you ever held anybody for 8 seconds?
That's a long time.
Yes. And I go, but you play in the electronic world for 6 hours a day.
Yeah.
I'm asking for less than 2 minutes
Yeah.
of human connection.
Yeah.
Now, the older generations, they had more than 2 minutes every single day. My great-grandmother, for crying out loud, when I was a little kid, I'd spend my time with my great-grandmother. She was always visiting with her next-door neighbor friends or going to the post office and coming home 3 hours later because the whole community showed up to talk.
Yeah.
We don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
So if we're going to create balance, because electronics aren't going away. I mean, nobody's going to give up their cell phones or computers or iPads, right?
Right.
Then we need to understand what the dopamine world does and how to help our kids balance. There's research that proves going outside, being in nature is beneficial for the brain. How many kids play outside? I mean, the American Pediatrics Association just listed a warning that we have the most obese young population of any time because kids are more sedentary, their eating habits are bad, and it's all tied to, I mean, you have kids that will go 12 to 14 hours playing a game without eating. Yeah. And so it's just looking at how were we designed as humans?
Mm-hmm.
We weren't designed to be connected to a computer. Our
Right.
brain is very old.
Yeah. So in that, I have a question about that because I've heard that people can, like, for example, with pornography, that you can actually bond to, you know, the screen, this woman on the screen or a person on the screen, and that is, you know, can be problematic because what you want to do is bond with real people, good people in your life, your spouse or friends, not with somebody on a screen. So can you bond with somebody on a screen? Can there be oxytocin, or is that false and there's really none of that really happening?
Well, I can tell you that the American Pediatrics Association listed a warning that children under the age of 2 should not be on electronic devices because kids were bonding to the devices and not to their parents.
Oh, wow.
And that's not the
That's a very
oxytocin. Yes, that's playing in that dopamine addictive world.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So it's not
So,
oxytocin that they're experiencing, it's dopamine addiction.
you know, I wouldn't go as far as saying as a researcher that there's no oxytocin with that because I've never done research in that area. And so I don't want to say yes or no.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that we do know that graphic visual viewing changes neurological pathways. So that which would have naturally stimulated no longer does. And that's the same thing with drugs. So for example, no one ever gets back to the first high they got when they took drugs for the first time, because the brain is designed naturally to try to correct when something's wrong. So if someone takes meth and it suddenly rushes into those synapses all of this dopamine, the brain goes, no, 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 no. So it begins shutting off the natural production of dopamine, and it tries to fix the problem. Well, it can't. So when the person takes meth again, the brain's already trying to solve that problem. So they'll never get back to that first original high, but they try to, and that's why they continue to use it. That's why dopamine is the addictive hormone. So it's the same with visual viewing. The more graphic the viewing, the more production of dopamine.
Right.
And then you become acclimated, and then you step up, step up, step up, just like they do with drugs.
Yeah.
And so people need to understand that that change of that transmitter and how it's released in the brain, whether it's an uptake, so either it produces way too much or it makes it stay in the synapse too long. I can tell you any type of visual graphic viewing changes the process of the dopamine in the brain. It also alters the optical lens. You know, there's a lot of research that shows that what the lens responds to changes depending on how graphic of what they're
So
viewing.
it makes physical changes in the brain. I know it changes the wiring of the brain, even the optical lens. Wow, that is just amazing. And I try to explain that also in Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, is that whole process of developing tolerance, you know, to pornographic images, developing tolerance to that. And so you're always chasing that high. You're always trying to get more and more, but your receptors are shutting down. You're not producing as much. And kids need to know how their brains function and how their brains are affected by technology and by some of the content that they can view via their devices. It's only fair to teach them about this. So, we've talked about the role of these neurotransmitters and how they're impacted by technology. We talked about the importance of oxytocin and also a knowledge of dopamine. So when you also mentioned its role in producing anxiety, depression, suicide even. Do you have any research about technology, and suicide as far as that connection?
There's a lot of research that shows that the more individuals spend time, there's a lot of research that shows, for example, young women who spend a lot of time in social media have substantial increases in levels of depression and anxiety that can then lead to suicidal ideation. There's a lot of research that bullying has led to suicidal ideation within the electronic world. What we do have, it's always difficult to prove a direct cause and effect. It's kind of like many people ask, can you prove a violent video game caused someone to commit a crime? We can prove that a violent video game changes the neurological chemistry of the brain, but we can't prove that game then caused the person to go be violent. I mean, people are smart enough to make their own conclusions. We can prove changes in depression, levels of depression, because of how many hours people spend in the electronic world. We can prove changes of aggression based on how long kids play violent video games. We can prove, like I said, the increase of suicide ideation due to bullying and things like that. Can we directly say the electronic world causes a suicide? No, but we do know increased levels of depression, increased levels of anxiety is when people begin to think about suicide ideation.
Yeah.
And I think there's some research, I'm not aware of it, but I'm sure there's some research out there that bullying directly led to someone taking their life because they felt they had no way out of it.
Yeah. Yeah,
The
because it
most
follows
important,
you around. Used to
yeah,
be in my day. I remember getting bullied when
mhm,
I was in like 7th grade.
mhm,
And once I left school, went home, played with my neighborhood friends, that was all done. Like it was gone. And I just had to deal with it at school. And, my mother taught me just kill them with kindness. Like, don't let these kids see that they're getting you upset. And then you can, just be nice to them, shrug it off, don't let them see you sweat. But that's not quite, it doesn't quite work the same way in today's world where, you're followed around and everything is blasted over a huge network. And you're just trying, it used to be hard enough to navigate this, adolescence, but now you're you're in a minefield because if you tick the wrong person off or maybe even don't respond to a boy asking you for a nude picture, then your whole world online can be blown up with threats or with bullying or with um, lies about you. So I don't know. I really I
just
want to
getting
help parents navigate this with their kids. So what would you say? So let's talk about safe amounts of time on technology. What would you recommend? What is, you know, what do the experts say about how much time should kids, let's first talk about kids in elementary
mhm,
school or like 3 to, 8,
mhm.
that kind of elementary school, 3 to 11, something like that. How much time should they be on electronics?
I'm going to go back to what your statement was on bullying for just a minute, though.
Okay, sure.
Parents need to understand that the adolescent brain is not developed fully in females till the about the age of 24 and males to the age of 26. Adults with fully developed brains are dealing more in the cerebral cortex, which is the reasoning,
Right.
thinking part of the
Yep.
brain. Yep. Young people are processing more in the limbic system. So, like when parents today tell a child, well, don't let that thought bother you, or just get over it, or leave it alone. If they were playing more in their cerebral cortex and reasoning area, they could probably set that aside. Where they're more emotionally based, that emotional trigger gets them oftentimes caught in what we call a thinking loop, where if someone makes a negative comment, you or I could reason, who was it that said it? Why did it matter? I don't care.
Right.
Where a kid will continue to play that thought over and over and over again, that then intensifies the anxiety, depression, and potential suicide ideation. What parents need to understand, because of what you pointed out, bullying in the electronic world is so graphic, so overwhelming, so blatant, that they have to help kids understand how to do disruptive thought patterns so that when they get caught in a thinking loop, they can back out of that, and teach them skill sets, whether it's shifting the channel to focusing on some really good rhythmic patterns of music, whether it's taking a hike in nature. Because oftentimes kids don't know how to disrupt the thinking loop they get caught in. And the only thing they micro focus on, especially if it's fed by social media and many, many people begin to join in that process, is that one thought that was negative,
Yeah.
which then can go very bad.
Yeah. And it's the same thing that oh, sorry to interrupt you. It's the same thing that we talk about in Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, that can do plan. Like, what do you do with those memories,
Mhm.
of the bad pictures that keep popping up in your mind? And it's really that same skill, that disruptive skill where you're saying, okay, I'm going to, as soon as those things pop up, I'm going to think about this other thing that's emotionally exciting for me, that is interesting to me, that I can create a neural pathway away from, that original picture that I saw that's so disturbing.
Mhm.
So same thing with the bullying, right? It's you, that thought, that what they said, and just keep stewing in it, and then you have to find some ways to go away from that.
Yeah, shift that. And it's important to understand that That's kind of how a kid's brain is designed. And so we have to help them understand that. In regards to age, I haven't seen clear research that's been done. Now, I can tell you the World Health Organization has issued statements on age, like when should a child have a cell phone and how many hours should they be involved in that. Australia did a lot of studies that showed anything above 3 hours dramatically changed the impact of depression and anxiety. The American Pediatrics Association has said children under age of 2. I would tell you children under the age of 5. You know, if we nowadays in our culture see a little baby sitting in a high chair who begins to, be upset. When I was a kid, when I was a mother, we would give our kids crayons and a piece of paper, right? Now you see babies being handed an iPad or a cell phone. And instead of creating neurological growth, that kind of shuts the brain down. Parents need to understand that the longer kids can stay in tactile activities that involve hands, eye coordination, that stimulates the brain far better than playing an electronic game. So the longer parents can allow their children to develop their brain by making mud pies, playing with logos, drawing, playing with crayons, playing an instrument, the better neurological growth is created. There's disputing factors. There's people who want to say that video gaming creates neurological growth. There's people that will say that the electronic world does not promote neurological growth. The only studies I've really looked at was military saying that increase your reflexes. All the other studies I've seen shows that there's even a thinning in the cerebral cortex when kids spend too much time in the electronic world. We were designed, there's so much research that shows that when we manipulate something with our hands, we maintain the information better than if we type it
You'll
on
take notes with your,
Yeah.
you actually write out notes, you actually remember them better than if you're typing them on
Yep.
a screen.
Yep, that's the research. And if you even read the old-fashioned books, turn the pages, fill the paper. And so parents need to be mindful of that. My recommendation is the longer your child can be without a cell phone or the electronic iPad, the better. And the problem we have is in the educational system now, kids are being given a Chromebook the minute they go into school. Now, educational programs, CAD programs, engineering programs, they don't carry the same side effect as electronic social media and video gaming because they're not changing their screen or image every 13 seconds. So yes, there's a downside. Yes, there's that overstimulation, but not the same as the social media and video gaming world. And I know why, we're going to that. But you have even like France, for example, they don't allow personal electronics in the classroom because they've seen the issues. India and Korea are getting ready to pass anti-social media laws. And so as parents, if our kids have to be in electronics, then we need to be mindful of how many hours they're out. I recommend if you're going to be an hour playing a video game, then an hour outside. And that kids, it's not only just handing them a smartphone, but you're handing them the world. Should an 8-year-old have a smartphone? Unlimited access to everything that's out there. Should a 12-year-old? Parents need to be mindful of that. Do I want my 12-year-old trying to navigate adult content? And electronics is the #1 place now where perpetrators go there to groom their victims. Do I want my child involved in that world? And, parents will say, well, I've educated my kids. And I'm like, all your child has to do is take a picture in front of the school that they're at, and a perpetrator knows where they are, even if they never share their name.
Great advice. So let's just talk about managing this with your children. Maybe, I don't know if you have any specific parent advice for helping to manage tech use with their kids without shaming, without, being over controlling. What are some tips for parents in dealing? Because so many kids, they're 10 years old and they want an Instagram because all their friends have Instagram, or they're 12 years old and they want, to be on Snapchat because all their friends, that's how they are communicating. And how do parents who don't want their kids on Instagram or Snapchat, deal with that?
Well, first of all, parents have to remember they're the parent and that they own that electronic device, not the kid.
Yeah.
On my website, I have a family media plan that I recommend families do together, where they decide what the limits should be. For example, one thing I tell parents, electronics should never be in bedrooms at night, ever.
Yep.
Go back to the old-fashioned alarm clock. There's research that shows just having the device in the room without even being on it disrupts sleep patterns. Our young people,
That's probably what's happening with me. I need to take this and
yes,
charge it somewhere else.
yes, and it's just our brain is conscious to that device and waiting for it to go off because that's our world. And so those should go into a central area and off. And if you have to go back to just one phone, that's the emergency phone, and you have to go back to old-fashioned alarm clocks, that's what you use. So the first thing I tell parents is no cell phones in the bedroom. You also may think your teenagers have gone to bed, but research shows they're on their phones under their pillow, hoping nobody will catch them. Yeah. Second, I think families can decide when they come on in the morning and when they go off, and that they set times when they aren't present at mealtime or family game. The other thing I tell families is use this media as a family. Watch a YouTube video together and then go create whatever it is you were watching. Watch a speech and then discuss the content. There's ways to help our kids use this in a positive way. Do a positive media challenge that everybody who's going to post in a Snapchat or a Facebook has to do so in a positive, uplifting way, and then report back on that. The other thing parents need to know is they have complete access. They have the right to request passwords. They have the right to actually, like some people I know share all one set, like Apple ID, so they can see every text message, every Snapchat that goes out there. Well, if I know my parents going to see what I'm going to post, there might be a little bit of mindfulness of what I go to post. Yeah. Apple, I know the iPhone has parental controls. Use them. There's filters that you can buy. Use them. Just be mindful that, I lecture, this is the smartphone generation. Are we smarter than our smartphones? If we are, then we're okay setting limits. We're okay setting controls. There's apps that kids should never download that are extremely dangerous. The parents need to look those up and say, you can go on a search engine and say apps that should not be on kids' phones, and you'll get a list. There's a list on my website. Be mindful that you have the right to say no. Now, I get the whole kids thing. This is my whole social outlet. So I have parents who say, great, then we share the same Apple ID so I can see when you're invited and what's going on. So there's ways to do things to keep kids safe. And at the end, you have to be a parent. And there are times when you simply say, I know everyone has this, but this isn't an appropriate app for you.
Yeah. That's great. And I really do think this idea of the parent owning the technology and lending it out to the child, there's a psychological difference between the child saying, this is my phone, you gave it to me for Christmas, right? Mm-hmm. I think you give, if you get a phone or an iPad, it's a family iPad and this child can use it, not you're giving it to them, because then they feel like it's their territory and they get this, total control and they can say what's on it and what's not and how they use it. I mean, so if you're going to maintain control, you have to, or some modicum of control, you have to own the device and lend it out according to your rules.
And technically, legally, I think there's been some clarification that the parents own the phone.
That's right. Even the parents are paying for.
Even if they gave it as a gift, the parents still have the right to control that, take it away, and do all those things. Now, I don't recommend parents get frustrated and suddenly take away electronics because they're going to see. I mean, we've actually ended up with kids admitted to psychiatric wards because their parents took their cell phone away, which is one, their social outlet, and two, their addiction with the dopamine in the brain. And so parents just need to teach kids balance. Isn't it interesting how things come out, like when cigarettes came out? I use this example. Everybody thought they were great. You could see pictures of pregnant women smoking, pictures of athletes smoking, and it was supposed to be healthy for us, right?
Yeah.
Then
healthy for your throat.
Yes, and then the research came into place, And we backed up. And now you don't see any posters of athletes being prescribed cigarettes, right?
You don't see any candy cigarettes. I used to
No.
have, I remember seeing, we used to get candy cigarettes.
Mhm.
My mom used to buy us candy cigarettes.
I had them as a kid, thought they were fun. We did the same thing happened with the electronic device. Yep. It came on the line. We saw no negative side effects. It was like, I can keep track of my kids this way. I can know where they're at. This is cool, communication. And there's been some wonderful blessings of this electronic world. But now the research is coming in place, and we're starting to see there is also negative side effects when there isn't balance.
Yeah.
And so
So
parents need to know that.
yeah, they do. And parenting in this age is quite the job. It's there's a lot to it.
Mhm.
And that's why you and I are trying to make it a little easier by giving some good information to parents so that they don't have to go out and, get a PhD, but they can benefit from your research. And so that's really great. So what's now? Do you have any upcoming like technologies that are getting more popular that you want to warn parents about? I know we've talked about, virtual reality, and I'm not sure how that's catching on. But
That virtual reality world is scary because of how it trips the brain.
yeah.
It might be one thing when you're using that virtual reality to feel like you're flying through the Grand Canyon. It's a whole nother ballgame if you're viewing more graphic, violent video games or graphic sexual images, because that virtual reality actually tricks the brain into thinking you're actually there and participating in it. If anybody has seen any of the videos of people wearing that and they're supposed to like walk on a ledge, you can tell them trying to balance because their brain really thinks they're there.
Yeah.
And so that's not my area of research, and I'm not sure the level of dopamine stimulation or the changes, but I can tell you there's some research done like for Japan. And Japan is having some interesting social dynamics because the young people work long hours and they come home and they're bonding to their electronic boyfriend and girlfriends. They literally have technology that memorizes their habits so that when they come home, they ask them how their day was, how this project went they were working on, starts their coffee. They have a full conversation. I mean, I know this
is not a person. This is like a robot in a sense.
It's a computer. Like there's been a few movies about people falling in love with a robot, right? Well, in Japan in particular, and maybe in other countries, that's what they're dealing with is young people aren't dating and socializing. They're going home to their robots. And so technology has amazing benefits, but when it's out of balance, it has negative side effects. And that's what parents have to look at, whether it's that virtual world, whether it's that video game, whether it's Alexa, right? I mean, my great-grandmother would have never imagined that you walked into the house and told somebody to play a song or what their weather was, right?
Yeah.
I don't have any of those in my home, but I just think it's funny. Everybody goes, Alexa this or da-da-da-da. And I'm like, you're not even talking to a person. And so we just have to be mindful of.
And that could get really confusing to a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old. Like, I just talked to Alexa. I'm just talking to, and I ask Alexa for whatever. And there have been some problems with that. Kids getting served inappropriate content via Alexa.
Yeah.
So
We have to be mindful.
So, with all of this, what are the signs that maybe a parent could be aware of that their child is consuming too much, or being on electronics too long? How can parents gauge that? Because maybe kids are different, and what are going to be the outward signs that kind of should be a red flag to parents about technology use?
I think the first thing that I would say is kids are different, but neurologically the brain's wired the same. There can be genetic differences in a brain. We know some people are more susceptible to addictions than others, but foundationally brains are wired the same. So any parent needs to understand the risk factors when usage goes more than 3 hours.
Okay.
And we have a national average of about 6.5 in the United States. And so parents need to balance that. If we are going to stay at 6.5 hours a day in usage, then what are the kids doing that helps stabilize outside the electronic world? They can watch for changes in behaviors like increased aggression or withdrawal. A lot of kids begin to no longer socialize. Like the Center for Disease Control shows that this generation prefers to spend more time alone by themselves in their bedrooms versus hanging out with friends. Like in the 80s, the CDC said we usually went out 3 to 4 times a week. They're saying this generation goes out on average less than 1. And so parents need to be mindful, watch their social interaction. If they tend to only socialize via that electronic world, then that's a red flag. And so it's just balance. You know, you might have kids that are really good at texting and then really good at hanging outside and playing hide and seek or something else. There's balance. You listen to employers nowadays, they will tell you that the rising generation is brilliant, but they don't know how to socialize and interact like the older generations. I mean, I've had CEOs say, I almost felt the interview would have gone better, Dr. Kane, if we had text back and forth. I mean, isn't it so strange? You've seen kids in a circle texting each other, not talking, texting. And they're not texting people who are someplace else. They're texting each other across the way. So parents need to help kids socialize. Help them understand how to have eye-to-eye contact and to communicate and to put the cell phones down. And if they see kids reacting very negatively and emotionally disruptive because of time in or time taken away, those are red flags.
Well, this has all been so great, such good information and a lot of food for thought and a lot of great specific advice for parents. Do you have anything? So where can parents find more? You say you have a website. So tell
Right.
us what your website is.
It's Totem Links, which is TOTUMLINK.com. It stands for whole in Latin, totemlink.com.
Totemlink.com. Okay.
We will be posting and getting ready to release a lot of the research, and we're actually going to do online videos and modules in the mental health area for parents to watch, but those are coming. They're not there yet. There are a lot of books like Glow Kids, iGen. There are books that parents can read. And I think we know, like, there's a little bit of common sense that we know that this isn't quite right. And so it's just listening to that inner voice. There's my TED Talk on the website. There's a lot of videos, and if they want to share this information with other people, they can use those as well.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Kane. I really appreciate that. Is there anything else you want to throw out there for parents? Any other advice for them as they try to navigate and try to help their kids grow up in a balanced way so that they don't get addicted to technology? And also, if they feel like their kids are addicted to technology, what do they do? Like, where do they go for help? Other than your website, they could start there.
They need to create a family media plan, and they need to educate the kids about the brain. These are brilliant kids. And I find when I lecture to high schools, they're fascinated. And a lot of kids, and one of the questions I ask at every assembly I do you think cell phones are addictive? 99.9% of the kids raise their hand. And the other thing I ask them is, do you think cell phones can be harmful? And I usually get about an 80 to 85% ratio in the quiz that I do electronically that kids say yes. So kids know that they're addictive. Kids know that they're harmful. Just come up with the plan together. There's been a lot of research on the qualitative, not quantitative level, where they've had kids put their cell phones or pull out of the electronic devices for several days, and they've seen a change in the mood behaviors. And so kids know. It's just as a family, make some plans together. I have teenagers tell me, you know what, Dr. Kane, you get my mom off Facebook, I'll give up Snapchat. So where's our example? I mean, look at husbands and wives. They go to dinner and they're both on their electronic
I
devices.
know. I've seen it. I've seen it. And I just, I've been in, uh, and I've tried to make some rules with my own adult children, saying, you know what? Hey, when we're all together, let's put our cell phones down unless we want to share something with the family, right?
Yep.
And the other thing that I have been doing is if I'm, especially with my little grandson, who is close to 2 years old now. And I have to say, my daughter's very careful about, the interaction he has with these devices. Um, but one thing I do is I say, if I have to do something with my phone, with that little 2-year-old nearby, and he's there, I say, Grandma needs to do X, right? I'm just going to answer this question, and then I'm going to put it away. So they at least know that I'm not just lost into this hole of whatever, right? That I'm doing something specific, and then I will put it away. And I'm intentional about that. And, my ideal is that I never have to deal with my phone when I'm watching my grandson. But if I do, I try to tell him what I'm doing and then get right back to him and put that thing away. So I think it's when I see parents lost into this and ignoring their kids, and their kids are like begging for, attention. I don't know. It kind of hurts my heart. when I see
Recently there was a photographer, and I wish I could remember his name, but he did all the black and white photos of people, and then he took the cell phones out of their hands. So you just see these poses.
Yeah.
It's an interesting presentation of how our world has changed. Like, he had a picture of a bride and groom both sitting there on their phones, and it's their wedding day. And I thought, wow, we've culturally changed. So as adults, what are your kids seeing in your electronic use?
Yeah. Right.
Second,
You got to model that behavior.
put in a family plan.
Yep.
Don't be afraid to set limits. Go back and remember, we're the parents, they're the child. Help the kids, educate them really about the neurology of their own brain.
Yes.
And then use social media in positive ways that unite the activities of the family instead of isolate. That's why, I'd love us to undo my statement of we're the most social, antisocial generation. We have people connecting with people they haven't talked to for 40 years. But it's not like, AT&T's old slogan was reach out and touch someone. That was a phone call. We don't even get phone calls nowadays. I mean, I've even had situations where I will go to call my kids and they say, Mom, text me. And I'm like, I didn't want to text you. I wanted to talk to you. And so we have to go back.
Well, Dr. Kane, thank you so much again for all of this fascinating and helpful information for parents. And we're really glad you've taken the time to spend. We'll definitely include a link to your website. And I do really encourage parents to do a family media plan. Just spend some time to figure out how you're going to use technology intentionally and not be used by it, right? To make it so that technology is enhancing your relationships, enhancing your life, and not, destroying your relationships. So,
yeah, it's a good point.
Thank you so much. And hopefully we can talk to you again someday. Thank you so much for being on.
You bet. Bye-bye.